All right, so back to the plan. So there's Samuel with his giant buckets of tomatoes, looking very proud of his harvest. So that's the goal of this next section is to figure out we can get to a point where we can have big crates of tomato mania like that. So let's see what we can do. Now, pretty shortly after you plant, especially with warm season, but also with cool season things, you're going to want to think about frost prevention. And this one always sneaks up on me in the fall in particular, but especially in the spring, we get some late frosts. It's not a bad idea to have some row cover around. And we're going to talk more about row cover here in a second as well, too. But as I mentioned before, this is like a fabric, and you can really buy it through almost any seed supply company anymore. It's becoming a lot more common at garden centers. A lot more people are using row cover in the home gardening world than they used to. Actually, I drove by Walmart the other day, and I noticed that they had row cover over all of their plants they had out for display in front of the Walmart super center. So I took a picture of it like any good extension specialist does, posted on social media. All right, so floating row covers, as I mentioned before, this is basically a fabric. And the thing that's cool about it, and the thing that's nicer about it than actual plastic film or plastic itself, is that it is breathable, right? So it doesn't get nearly as hot inside of there as plastic does, which may not sound like a good thing, but it actually is, because usually this is a real issue with plastic. You can suffocate and cook those plants really fast. Whereas row cover, you can actually leave it on during the day and it doesn't get too hot for the plants. Now there's some exceptions to that sometimes happen, but for the most part, it doesn't get too hot, especially really thin row cover like what you can see here in this picture. Now, in addition to frost protection, and that's literally what it does, it's a mechanical barrier for frost. It also can be useful for other things as well too. And a lot of organic farmers and organic gardeners are now using row cover really as much for insect control as anything else. And in this case, what you do is you buy basically the thinnest type of row cover you can get, which is like the 0.25 or 0.5 ounce per yard row cover. And you actually cover the plants and leave them covered so that things like squash bugs can't get to your cucurbits, or cabbage worms and cabbage moths can't get to your brassicas. And those two particular pests, this is pretty much the only organic way to manage those things. The other big battle that you're going to fight, in addition to pests and frost, is, of course, weeds, right? And so we talked earlier about cover crops and how they help compete with weeds. But there's a couple things you want to keep in mind when it comes to weeding and cultivating. First, again, think about the life cycle of a weed and what it does in the ecosystem of your garden, right? Weeds want to move into bare ground. They want to get good full sun exposure, and they want to just take off and colonize areas, right? So what we want to do is try and find ways to compete with them, especially for light, whether it's through planting densities or mulches or other things in order to reduce the amount of light that plant will have in order to grow. The other thing that's really important when it comes to light is that you may or may not know most weed seeds are stimulated to germinate by very short flashes of light. So when you turn over your soil with a tiller or with a chopper hoe or something like that, you actually can, even a microsecond of exposure of full sun to a weed seed is actually going to stimulate it to germinate and grow and compete with your crop plants. So what we like to do when we're actually doing cultivation and weeding is disturb the soil as little as possible so that we don't re-stimulate weed seeds to germinate. Right, and so the kind of tool that you have can really dictate this really well. This is what's called a hula hoe, right? And they call it that because it has this, or sometimes it's called a stirrup hoe. And it basically has a sharp edge on the front and the back. And what you can do is you can run that sharp edge back and forth across the top of the soil surface, and you're going to kill those plants by cutting them in half. The plant's going to just lay there on the ground and get cooked by the sun and die, hopefully. And you're going to disturb the soil as little as possible because you're not flipping soil over. You're just scraping across the top of it, right? And there's a lot of other awesome tools out there. So this is one of the big take-home messages for me when it comes to weeding. Is, you know, you can buy those things at the hardware store that kind of look like this, right? What they call a garden hoe at the hardware store. But it, you know, what that thing is really good for is for mixing concrete and for hilling potatoes. And that's really what it's originally meant for, was for hilling potatoes. If you want to really kill some weeds, you want this thing right here. This is called a scuffle hoe, S-C-U-F-F-L-E, scuffle. And it's got 3 sides to it that are extremely sharp. And you want to sharpen them actually a couple times a year to keep them very sharp. And you basically just take that tool and put it down and run this across the surface of the soil, just like you do a Swiffer in the kitchen, right? And it literally, you just runs across the surface of the soil very quickly, and it just chops those plants in half and leaves them laying there. And those plants, again, you know, will desiccate and die real fast after the sun comes out. And you can just keep moving. And so we have a lot of these at the research station of different sizes, so you can get in between small crops or in between small rows like this. And they're really useful. So if you know anybody that really likes to garden, or you're trying to figure out something to put on your Christmas wish list, put this on there. You'll be really glad you have one. And there's actually this neat company, this a Kansas-based company called Rogue Tools. And Rogue, actually, what they do is they buy old agricultural discs, you know, the discs that are used, they pull behind tractors out in the big fields. And so this blade right here was actually made from a disc. And what's cool about that, in addition to it just being a neat repurposing of materials, is, you know, those discs, they don't make them like they used to. That's extremely hardened steel, and it stays nice and sharp after you get them sharpened. So they're very high quality in that way. I don't usually like to push, you know, particular companies, but it's a Kansas-based company, so we figure that's okay. What about pruning? So especially early in the season with tomatoes, you're going to want to do some pruning, and really talking about tomatoes specifically here. Depending on what type of tomato, if it's an indeterminate tomato or a determinate tomato, and depending on what type of trellis system you use, is going to dictate some of your pruning. But pretty much all tomatoes are pruned up to what we call the first fruit hand. So if you take a tomato plant, and they're usually about this size when they get pruned for the first time, maybe a little bigger, and you go, you know, tomatoes are a vine, right? So start at the bottom of the vine and work your way up until you find the first flower cluster, right? So the leaf, and let's just imagine that this has a flower cluster right here. The leaf that's directly below that flower cluster is what we call the first fruit hand, right? And so what it's doing is it's basically a little photosynthetic factory for that first fruit cluster. So you want to leave that leaf there, and you want to prune everything below that. And that's typically the lowest 4 to 6 inches of the plant, kind of depending on where it sticks out its first flower cluster. Now, after you've harvested that flower cluster, you're going to move up the vine, right? And if you want to, you can continue to prune from the bottom up until you get to the next flower cluster. For most of us that are growing in cages or in a home garden setting, we aren't typically doing that, but you could if you wanted to, okay? Now, one of the reasons that we like to prune is in order to help increase the reproductive or the fruiting growth of those plants, right? Anybody can grow a tomato that's 6 feet tall, right? It's really not a hard thing to do. What's hard to do is grow a tomato that's 5 feet tall and covered with fruit, right? So what we like to do with pruning is, if you can take some of that leaf tissue out of there, it's actually going to send a message to the plant saying, hey, less shoot, more fruit, right? And so there's a balance, and people that grow tomatoes sort of professionally, you could say, there's a real art form to this balancing vegetative and generative growth. Now, you do want to be careful that any tools that you're using, if you're using pruning scissors or a knife, it's a good idea to clean it with like rubbing alcohol or something like that to get it, especially before the first time you use it for the day. But even if, every 5 or 10 plants, it's a good idea to clean it as well too. And we always want to follow the rule of not working those plants when they're wet. So not pruning, not doing any suckering, not any kind of stuff. You wait until the leaves actually dry before we start to mess with them. Lots of different ways to do staking and trellising. I think a lot of people are interested in vertical trellising these days as a way to sort of increase their per square foot production. And it is a nice way to utilize that vertical space. The other thing that's important is for fruiting vegetables, you really need to do this in order to reduce fruit rotting and things like that can potentially happen. Like with cucumbers, if you want them to form a nice straight cucumber, you really have to hang them up on a trellis. Similarly, if cucumbers are laying on the ground, they'll have the side that's on the ground will be yellow. That's what we call yellow belly, right? And so if we put cucumbers up on trellises, they'll be green all the way around. So especially for fruiting vegetables, it's really helpful to have those things up on trellises or in some type of trellis system to keep them up off the soil. Now, most of us growing tomatoes are familiar with this. This is just your standard tomato cage. I am a big fan of using nice, tall cages. Typically, if you're growing indeterminate varieties like many people do in the home garden, those smaller 4-foot cages aren't quite tall enough, and they tend to sort of explode at the top. So this is like a 6-foot tall cage, which is a really nice one. And I think, I've got a picture here too. This is actually not too far from y'all. This is a good friend of mine, Randy Clark in Buhler, Kansas. And he's got a small diversified farm. He sells at the farmer's market in Wichita and a couple other places. And he's got a fair number of tomatoes, and also he sells sheep meat as well too, or lamb meat. And you can see he's one of the few commercial growers that I work with that uses cages still. And one of the things that he likes about them, and I completely understand, is, for wind, this cage is a lot more stable in the wind of central Kansas than maybe a stake and weave system is. And you can tell by looking at this guy's trees, obviously he's been getting a lot of wind in the last few years there. So the nice thing about them is they are a little bit more stable in that way. You can always add T-posts as well on the windy side of those cages in order to keep them from going anywhere. Or if you don't have that many T-posts, you can put one in at each end and run a wire through there. We've done stuff like that before back home. And you can see Randy's also using hay mulch here, so it's a nice way to conserve soil moisture and keep some of those weeds out as well too. So this is sort of a hybrid between the stake and weave system and the cage system. And I don't really have a good name for it. But in this case, we'll actually put wire fencing up along in a fence, basically in a fence, right? Maybe this side's a little better. And in this case, we actually had tomatoes planted on both sides of that wire fence every 18 inches. Excuse me. And then we would attach the tomatoes to the wire fence with this nifty little contraption known as a fast tapper. And this is usually the part of the Master Gardener training where I start fast happening things together and everybody gets all excited. And unfortunately, we aren't going to do that today. So I'm going to have to buy every county a fast happener and probably give them to the extension agents. I guess maybe they can do the fast happener demonstration. This is a super handy tool. They're not super cheap. They're about $50, but it actually has vinyl tape that's in a coil right here behind this person's hand, and that vinyl tape runs up through the machine And then when you click it one time, it essentially stretches that tape across the mouth of it. And then you wrap the tape around it, and then you click it again, and it actually cuts it and staples it all in one motion. So they're very fast. We used to use them a lot in tree nurseries that I worked at when I was a kid. And you can just get a lot of work done with them. And they're really good, not just for vegetables, but any type of horticultural plant that you're managing on your property. Now this system works okay. It works fairly well for tomatoes. This particular grower really liked this system for tomatoes. This system works incredibly well for something like cucumbers, right? So these are actually some grafted cucumbers. We graft cucurbits every once in a while too for the fun of it. And in this case, we're using what people call cattle panel or hog panel. It's basically a rigid wire fencing. And you can buy this stuff at a farm supply store. Usually they're in 16-foot panels. And the thing that's nice about these panels is they're rigid enough that in this case we have 1, 2, 3 T-posts holding this up, but the wire itself is rigid enough that you just wire this panel to those T-posts and it sits up there by itself. It doesn't have to be stretched like fencing does, like wire fencing does. These panels are really rigid and strong on their own. So all you really have to do is just use those T-posts to hold them up in the air, essentially, and they stand on themselves. And what we'll do in this case is we'll use that fast tapener to attach the cucumber vines just at the very bottom, essentially. And then once they start to grow, cucumbers send out these tendrils, right? So they're going to attach themselves to that cattle panel. But we use the fast tapener to just get them pointed in the right direction, essentially. You can also use cattle panels to do fun stuff like this. You can make arches with them, and I've seen people make arches with them to grow all kinds of stuff, whether it's flowers or vegetables. In this case, these are some specialty melons that a friend of mine was growing down in Edgerton. And most of the time, this isn't the case. With this particular variety of melon, you can actually just let it hang from the vine, and they won't drop off. Most of the time, if you're going to trellis melons like this, you're going to want to hang like an onion bag, or sometimes people actually use like a pantyhose, and essentially tie the onion bag to the cattle panel, and then put the fruit into it. And as the fruit develops, the weight becomes put on the onion bag instead of the vine, right? So that system works pretty well too. Last but not least, we have the stake and weave system. So this is really the most common for commercial farmers, people, especially farmers market growers and that kind of thing, but especially also the really big farmers that are doing, 20, 30, 50 acres of tomatoes. This is what they would do. They wouldn't mess with cages or anything like that for that many tomatoes. Now, in this case, what you do is you put a stake in, and these are wooden stakes in the middle. I like to have T-posts at the end, at least, for strength. And then we've got wood posts. We also use rebar oftentimes for this system, and that works really well. But you want a post between every other plant. So you should end up with 2 plants between each post. Okay, so this picture was taken probably after the first string was put on. After you put the posts in, you start to string them. And you essentially put a string on about every 5 to 7 days as the plants grow until they get to the top of the post. Okay, so it does take a little bit of maintenance that way, and you absolutely can't forget to do it. It's one of those things you really, really are going to regret it if you procrastinate this. But for example, in this case, we put the first 2 strings on. We'll probably come through and prune these pretty quickly after that. And then we'll put a string on about every 7 days. Now, you can see these plants are a little bit bigger by this stage. In terms of how the strings actually go on, this is going to be the most difficult part of distance education learning today. So let's see if I can do it. The way you're going to want to do that is tie your string at the end of the row, right? And then bring the string around the outside of the post, go down to the next post, wrap it all the way around the post, and then you always want to keep the string between you and the plant, right? And you go to the next post and wrap it all the way around. You go all the way down, all the way to the end of the row doing that same thing. And then you start at the other end of the row and do the exact same thing from the other side, right? So by the end of the day, what you end up with is not really a weave. You're not really weaving between the plants. Instead, what you're doing is you're creating a channel, right, with these two strings that are attached to each post. And you really want the central, if not the entire, shoot of that plant, or the top part of that plant, totally held in by that channel that you've formed with those strings. And as they grow, you just continue to add a string, again, every 5 to 7 days, depending on how quickly they're going. Now, one of the mistakes I see people make when they're kind of new to this is if you get ahead of yourself, that can be a problem. So, a lot of times people will try and put strings like up here, and then they're going to try and pull those vines into those channels. But you really don't want to do that. You want to let the plant grow up a little bit, right? And then you want to bring the string in from underneath. You really, and the way I think about it is, I want to pick up those tomato plants by their armpits, right? You don't want to try and pick them up by their head and pull them through the channel. You want to grab them by their armpits and pick them up, just like you do your kid, or at least I used to. My kid's too big for that now. And you can actually buy string that is marketed specifically for this. I would not suggest using jute twine or that hemp twine that you can buy at the hardware store. That stuff, when it gets wet, it will stretch and break, and that can be a real problem. You definitely don't want that. So you want the poly or the plastic twine, and you can buy it actually in a box. And there's actually a place. Probably it could be, as far as I know, the only place in America you can buy a single box of twine. Actually, that may not be true. I think Hummert's now sells single boxes of twine, but Morgan County Seeds in central Missouri will sell you a box of twine like that for about $8. And the nice thing about it is that thing is a little dispenser in itself, so it keeps the string real tidy. You don't have issues with tangles and mouse nests and all that kind of stuff. And you can see in this case, we're using rebar actually as our posts. And rebar works really nice because it's reusable. Those wooden stakes, they tend to break over time, but rebar doesn't break, and quite frankly, is almost the same price as those wooden posts are anymore. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about irrigation and drip. So I think most of us know about the value of why water is so important for plants in terms of, providing them with things they need to go through photosynthesis and helping them uptake nutrients and things like that. But, keep in mind that water is moved through the plant by a process known as transpiration, right? And so transpiration is actually driven by the difference in the humidity in the outside air and within the leaf mesophyll cells. So essentially what that means is, on especially dry days, especially days that you have a lot of wind that's reducing the humidity around these leaves, those plants are going to need a lot of water, right? So, and it's something that we forget about oftentimes living in Kansas, is just how much wind there is here in this wonderful state. But you really, if you go outside of the Midwest, you notice the difference when you start to see how plants grow in other places and how much faster they grow in other places. And my personal theory is it has a lot to do with how much wind we have here. The other thing that's going to make a big difference in terms of irrigation is just understanding about the different types of soil and how the physical characteristics of the soil can affect how a plant has availability to water. So sandy soils are going to drain more quickly, and soils with more clay content are going to hold more water. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a second. Finally, you always want to think about watering the root zone. right? This is the basic tenet in any kind of irrigation management class, right? We want to make sure that the root zone has all the water that it needs. So in order to do that, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you define what the root zone is. You know, based on how old the plant is, based on, you know, what different type of plant it is, what type of crop it is, or what species of crop it is, they're going to have different rooting depths, right? So when the plants are really young, right after you've planted them, you're going to want to water them in short bursts very often, right? Whereas once they get older and bigger, you know, especially with deep-rooted crops like pumpkins and tomatoes and sweet potatoes, you can water those a lot less often. Now, in general, I think for most of us during the heat of the summer, you don't really want to water any less often than once a week. But if you know, sometimes we get a rain, and so, you know, hopefully you can get your irrigation done the old-fashioned way. Otherwise, I think you do want to make sure those plants have access to water at least once a week, if not more often, in sandier areas. Now, one of the big benefits, I think, of drip irrigation is that it allows you to keep the leaves of the plants dry. So this is a picture I took. This is a garden I managed. I've shown you some pictures of this garden already. And what you may or may not be able to tell from this picture is that this is a really, really great example of bacterial leaf spot. And bacterial leaf spot is caused by a bacteria, but this disease, and this is a pathogen that's fairly prevalent in this area, this disease is spread around and exacerbated by rain, right? Anytime the leaves, it rains, it allows for splashing of the bacteria to get around. And then that bacteria, like most microbes, requires a certain leaf wetness period in order for it to infect and cause disease of those leaves. So if we can keep the leaves dry, we can actually eliminate or significantly reduce, you know, a huge majority of the leaf diseases that happen on vegetables, and tomatoes in particular. And this is one of the reasons a lot of people like growing in protected environments, high tunnels and greenhouses and so on and so forth, is it's one of the best ways to manage leaf diseases organically. Now, this was a garden I was managing again a few years ago, and this guy actually had turf pop-ups in his garden. You can see from the size of the house back here that this person didn't have any shortage of money. So he had a really nice irrigation system which had turf pop-ups in all the garden beds that would come up twice a day and actually sprinkle these things with water, which is pretty much perfect conditions for any type of plant disease. So I essentially put a drip system in, and we never really had that problem before. So I am a big fan of using drip irrigation, and actually just last year we released a K-State fact sheet about drip irrigation, both for home gardens and community gardens. We've also got a few videos online that you can find through the KSRE YouTube channel as well in terms of how to put together drip irrigation systems. And I won't go into the details too much today about how to put together a drip system. I just wanted to explain the two basic types that there are. And then, as I mentioned before earlier, you know, a lot of this whole idea with irrigation and using drip is based on the physical parameters of your soil. So if you have high sand content, that water is going to flow through. It's going to be more porous, right? And so this distribution cone of water is going to be more narrow and tall, right? Whereas with clay, it's going to be a lot more fatter, right? That water is not going to be able to get as deep because of that. And it's also not going to drain as fast, right? Which is one of the things we don't like about clay. So there's two basic types of drip irrigation systems used for vegetables. One is the low pressure system, which is what we have here. And then I'll show you here in a minute also high pressure systems. So low pressure systems are based around this stuff right here called drip tape, or sometimes called T-tape. And drip tape is very inexpensive. You can buy a 7,500 foot roll. It's a 7,500 feet roll of drip tape for about $150. So that's, what does that come down to? About $100 a mile you can actually buy drip tape. The disadvantage with this stuff is, part of the reason it's so cheap is, you know, it's not super strong. So mice and rodents and other things oftentimes like to chew on it. There's a fair amount of maintenance and fixing of leaks that goes along with using drip tape. It's always a good idea if you're using drip tape, anytime you turn on the irrigation system, to go ahead and walk the garden for 15 minutes and just make sure everything's working and you aren't having any problem with leaks or any issues like that. The other thing that I think is probably a little more relevant for home gardeners in particular is to understand that low pressure systems, they have this emitter that's built into the drip tape. You can see here in this picture, and you can get them at different spacings and stuff like that. But these emitters require a certain pressure or water pressure in order to put out the right amount of water. So if you have too high a pressure, it's going to cause a problem and blow the tape up. If the water pressure is too low, then it may not distribute well through the whole tube. So it's really important that you have the pressure at the right PSI. And so this is why we typically use a pressure regulator for these type of systems. So you sort of combine all these ideas together, and what I generally tell people is I really like low pressure drip systems for people that have, and this is what most people use in sort of the commercial vegetable production world. But if you have a fairly decent size garden like this one, something that's 100-foot long and 50-foot wide, or maybe larger than that, you're probably going to want drip tape, because it is nice in that it's inexpensive. You can have very long rows and you have good even distribution across the entire length of the row. But it's going to require a pressure regulator. So in that way, you're going to have a pressure regulator, over here or maybe over here somewhere where it comes in. And because of that, you're going to have to be able to irrigate sort of a fairly large area at a time. Otherwise, it's just not worth it to go and buy that pressure regulator and all that kind of stuff. Whereas with the other systems, you don't have to do that. So the other type of drip system is what we call a high pressure system. And in this case, instead of drip tape, you're using what we call drip tube, or sometimes it's called other things as well. Now you can buy drip tubing with the emitters built in already, like this roll of drip tubing here has emitters built in every 12 inches. Or a lot of times people will actually buy the emitters, and you basically get a little tool, like a punch tool, and you punch holes in a piece of solid pipe and put the emitters onto it. Now I can tell you from experience that if you have a lot of that stuff to make, you should get it with the emitters built in, because putting those emitters in, if you have a few hundred of them to do, it'll make your thumb hurt pretty quickly. It's not particularly fun. But it's very easy to find those things, the high pressure systems, typically at the big box stores. Most hardware stores carry high pressure systems. And oftentimes they sell rolls of drip tubing with, emitters pre-installed at 12 or 18-inch plant spacing, which is a pretty good rate to have it at. Now, one of the things, the whole idea about these high pressure systems and the way that they're different than the low pressure systems has everything to do with this emitter right here and the emitters that are built into this tubing as well. Because these are what are called pressure compensating emitters. And what that means is no matter the pressure that runs through that system, as long as it's high enough to supply the system with adequate water, those emitters will control the amount of water that comes out, per minute. In other words, the rate of the water flow coming out of those drippers. So for most of us that are running off of city water or rural water, that means you don't have to have a pressure regulator. You can basically just plug this into your hose, and this emitter itself will actually control the dripping rather than the pressure regulator. So that's one of the things that's really handy about that. It's also nice because it tends to be easier to find these things, at big box stores. You're not going to find any parts for a low pressure system at a regular hardware store, or even for that matter at most garden centers. You're really going to have to order that online. So, and then the last but not least, the other thing that's really nice about these high pressure systems is, again, it's fairly rigid plastic. So these things last a really long time, many years. And they're also very resistant to rodent damage. I mean, we have drip tubing at the research station that's been in the ground for 4 years in our blueberries. And we put it in the first year I was there, and we don't take it up in the winter. It just stays there all winter. And I think there's one spot where we had to replace it because it got eaten, or we're not sure. It might have gotten actually chopped by a student worker with a pair of pruners. But the mice are not able to chew holes in that stuff very well. So they're a little bit easier to manage that way. So the biggest detraction with these high pressure systems, really there's two disadvantages. One is because of the way those emitters work, you can't have as long a rows. You can only have rows that are up to about 200 feet long, which usually isn't a problem for most home gardeners, but can be for commercial growers. But more importantly, it's just way more expensive. On a per linear foot basis, it's like 10 times the cost to use a high pressure system than a low pressure system. But the reality is not very many home gardeners I know need mile and a half of drip tape either, right? So it could still be that it actually costs you less money to install a drip system with the more expensive materials because you don't have to buy 7,500 feet of drip tape in order to get what you need with the low pressure system. So this is just a picture of the high pressure system. This one, the emitter is built in here. This is a picture. This is actually in the Master Gardener's demonstration garden out at the research station. We helped them put a drip system in a few years ago, and that thing has been a major lifesaver out there. One of the things I really like about high pressure systems, is they're really nice for perennial crops, things like blueberries, things like fruit trees, things like, here's some blueberries here. This is the Master Gardener's blueberries out at the research station. And you can see they just put these high pressure tubing basically around the bushes, and they just leave them there, forever, essentially. And that's really nice because you don't have to worry about it. Similarly, if you had a garden that was the same square footage every year, especially for people that have raised beds with landscape timbers encompassing them, the high pressure system can work really well because in that case, you need the exact same length of drip tape or drip tube every year. So you can just, even if you take it out of the garden to do your tilling and all that kind of stuff, it's very easy to put it back in the garden in the spring and everything is the same length and ready to go. Whereas, if you have a garden that's something like this, the lengths of these rows may change a little bit from year to year, right? So it just kind of depends on what works best in your situation. Bottom line, soaker hoses are not the same as drip systems. And soaker hoses are okay for some things, but by and large, I'm not a big fan of soaker hoses. Usually they put out too much water to really consider them a drip system. If you see water ponding or pooling on the top of the soil, then it means it's going in there too fast, right? And that oftentimes happens with soaker hoses. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of soaker hoses that put it out at different rates, so I don't want to make any misrepresentations, but my experience has been that they generally put out water too fast to really be all that useful. Okay, so 10 ways to improve garden water use. Water deeply, but no deeper than the root zone. So, again, you always want to think about anytime you turn on a hose bib or a valve in your garden, you want to think about the roots of the plants that you're watering. Always think about the depth of the root zone and how much water it's going to take to get that root zone wet. Water slowly reduce the flow. So, I'm a big fan of using drip systems. They really are better for the soil. They're better for the plant. They're better for the gardener. There's very few disadvantages to using drip systems. Water infrequently but thoroughly. This is something that I think is, everybody thinks it's true except for me, quite frankly. With perennial crops like trees and shrubs and turf grass, we like to water those things infrequently but thoroughly to help encourage deep root systems so that those plants can survive a drought or a cold spell in the wintertime. But with annual vegetable plants, we're typically irrigating them, or at least we probably should be. So, you're not, I don't understand why we want to torture our plants just so we can get them through a drought when we already have an irrigation system already. You know what I mean? I think this is one of those common, it's like it sounds great to do this, and I think it is for perennial things, but not necessarily for annual things, right? So I don't really follow this rule in my garden myself. Using mulch is always a good idea to help make it receptive to water and help that water absorb, right? Watch out for leaks in the irrigation system, especially with drip irrigation. A small leak can turn into a pretty big problem because the drip irrigation system is going to run for a pretty extended period of time. Keep your garden free of weeds. They're going to take water from you. And trees can be actually one of the worst culprits of this. Some of these trees like to send little feeder roots over into the garden and steal water from you. It's a good idea to take a tiller and run it along the edge of the garden if there's a tree line along that side to help keep those feeder roots out of there. Bare soil is always a bad thing. You want to be covering it with mulch. You want to be covering it with cover crops. You want to be covering it with anything you can. But we always want to reduce the amount of bare visible soil. Avoid watering during windy weather. And again, this is one of those things that you'll read on the internet, or maybe you'll find in other master gardener manuals and things like this. It's a really good piece of advice if you're using overhead irrigation. But if you're using drip irrigation, this doesn't really matter, right? They tell you this because the wind is going to make that water evaporate, and so you're going to lose efficiency. But the reality is, around here, when it's windy, is really when the plants are stressed. So with drip irrigation, you don't necessarily need to follow this rule. Water early in the morning, right? This is another one of those things that I grew up, growing up working with plants and working in the garden. I always thought we had to water early in the morning. It just made sense. Like, this is what Dad always said, so this is what we're going to do. Well, I found out later that there's a reason Dad always said that, but it's not really applicable to drip irrigated systems. So we like to water in the morning, essentially to reduce the chances of leaf wetness on those plants, or minimize the amount of leaf wetness that's on the plant, right? But the reality is, with drip irrigation, there is no leaf wetness from irrigation. So again, this is one of those sort of old wives' tales that is very applicable for overhead irrigation, but not so much for drip, right? So just keep that in mind as well too. And most of all, sticking your thumb in the watering hose and spraying it around does not really count as irrigation. Quite frankly, I'm pretty sure this guy didn't grow this pretty nice looking garden by sticking his hand in the end of the hose anyway. But this picture came from my predecessor, so I like to keep it in here because I just think it's an awesome picture. So let me just scroll through. It looks like we're almost out of time. I would like to show you just a couple of pictures real quick, if that's okay with you guys, and then we'll go ahead and have about 10 minutes for questions. So let me just show you some quick examples, and I'm going to skip through this. So, we like to use row cover a lot with season extension. I've already mentioned this a couple times. One thing to keep in mind with row cover that can get you in trouble is when it snows, that row cover can actually suffocate the plants or it can smash the plants more often if they're not supported with hoops or wires. So it's a good idea to make sure that you have some type of framing or wire to support that row cover. In this case, I was using tomato cages that were kind of flipped inside of themselves into little triangles. Number 9 wire you can buy at a ag supply store like Tractor Supply or Orscheln's. Works really well. And this is what we do. We usually, cut the wire and then actually just literally stick the wire into the ground to hold it upright. Obviously, you can see there's no row cover on right now. This is what that wire would look like. You can see there's netting on here, bird netting to keep the rabbits off. And then this is our row cover. This is actually lettuce grown in what's called a Filtrex bag. So it's actually a container of sorts. It's kind of like a very large pantyhose, and it's filled up with like compost and mulch essentially. And in this case, I just seeded lettuce right on top of it. And then when it gets cold at nighttime, you can just cover that up. And you can see that row cover like that. So here you can see it, during when we get snows, that snow is actually a nice insulation for those plants. So they're actually probably pretty happy underneath there. But again, it is important to put some wire hoops up to support them from that. A lot of people like to use shade cloth, and shade cloth is becoming more popular for both home gardeners and commercial farmers as well. There's lots of interesting little PVC structures you can make and all kinds of stuff. But it does work fairly well, and people are finding that you can really increase your productivity, especially during a hot summer, with shade cloth. Now, this is out at my folks' place. I don't mind giving my dad a hard time. This is a couple summers ago, and it was really hot, and he had these really nice cantaloupe crop going, and the plants died from a disease, but there was just this huge number of fruit out there in the field, and he was worried they were going to just cook under the sun. So he put shade cloth down, and it helped some. But keep in mind, if you're going to use shade cloth, that shade cloth right there is going to get really hot, right, because it's black. And so shade cloth is really meant to hover above the plants. So I think in this case, we didn't really help ourselves very much, because just the heat of the shade cloth itself was not very good for the plants either. Wind is obviously a big issue in Kansas. This is a fun thing to do with fall planted cool season crops. These are Brussels sprouts here, but we also do this with broccoli and cabbage as well. You can actually just cut the bottom of a 1-gallon nursery container out until you make basically a sleeve or a collar, and just put that down into the soil and let it grow for a couple weeks, just until it has time to stiffen up and harden up a little bit. And that can be a nice technique for evading wind damage. I think a lot of people know what low tunnels are. You got to be really careful with low tunnels because they can get really hot really fast. The other thing that's tough about them is they also are very prone to wind, which we have lots of around here. So you want to be very careful about that. This is a tunnel we built out at the research station. It was actually movable, so we would actually drag it back and forth onto the rows that we had at that time. If you're going to put a low tunnel up, these roping systems will save your life. They're really, really good way to keep that plastic from moving, and it basically works just like a shoelace does on your shoes. We do a lot of work at the research station with high tunnels. So here's some high tunnels that we built. There's tomatoes in there. This is actually an overhead shot of the research station. So you can see we have 6 of these 4-season smaller tunnels. We've actually got, this is a half-acre multi-bay high tunnel here, and there's actually one here that's just not covered as well too. So we do a lot of work in high tunnels. This is our solo tunnel here. I caught this picture early one morning. I just thought it was very cool. This high tunnel has no end walls. The side walls are up. So there's really no heat being trapped in this structure at all. But look at how much frost there is here compared to there. It's a good teaching moment for our students, for them to understand that frost literally falls out of the air, right? You don't see it happen. But if you've ever walked around early in the morning, you know that underneath the eaves and the stoops, and certainly underneath a high tunnel, you're not going to have frost. We also use row cover within the high tunnels, and you can see some data we collected here in terms of some of the temperature differences. You can get incredible growth in high tunnels. These are some heirloom tomatoes. These are grafted ones actually here. These are English cucumbers. This is in Emporia. This is at a school garden. A lot of school gardens are getting big into high tunnels as well too, not only because of the productivity, but also the season extension side of it. And then there's also sort of this new area with movable high tunnels. They're kind of fun. And then last but not least, I wanted to show you all this. For in the home garden world, they have this thing called the caterpillar tunnel. And if you just ask Dr. Google what a caterpillar tunnel is, you can see why they call them that, because they kind of look like caterpillars with their roping system. But they're becoming really popular for small farmers, but also they work really well for homeowners and home gardeners, because you make the hoops out of a 21-foot piece of top rail from chain link fencing. and you can actually buy a bender to make that hoop from like Johnny's Seed Company, and then you go out and buy the materials themselves from the hardware store, essentially. And so it makes them really inexpensive and relatively easy to play around with without investing very much. So, just to summarize a little bit about that, a couple things to take home. Don't forget about the importance of that soil temperature. It's super important for plant growth, especially when you start thinking about trying to encourage things early in the spring. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that if you go looking through the seed catalogs these days, you'll find that there are varieties that are bred specifically for use in season extension techniques. So one of the things we didn't talk about was, in this row cover is used a lot to help increase cucurbit production, reduce insect pest damage, right? But cucurbits require bees for pollination, and the bees can't get into this row cover. So now a lot of people are selling what are called parthenocarpic varieties of cucumbers and other cucurbits as well, like squash, so they can grow them under row cover their entire lives and they don't have to be pollinated. So, you might look into some of these things because there really are varieties that are being better suited to season extension techniques. And of course, as always in Kansas, be prepared to chase a large piece of plastic or fabric. That just seems to be a common theme, at least for us most of the time. So again, I didn't get a chance to really introduce myself because I was sort of in a hurry earlier, but I am located out at the Olathe Horticulture Research and Extension Center. And we actually have a field day the last Saturday in July every year that's open to the public, and it's a fundraiser for our Master Gardeners program. And so we invite you all to come out there if you get a chance. And the station is generally open from Monday to Friday, 8 to 4. But we do ask that if you really want a tour, you should probably call us ahead of time and schedule an appointment, because oftentimes we're pretty busy out in the field or running through the state doing other extension stuff. So with that, it looks like there's just only a couple minutes left, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Jason? Can we grow zucchini like you were talking about? Cucumbers could be grown and hanging down. So zucchini squash could be the same way. Can they grow like on a tomato cage or something?
Well, zucchinis aren't really gonna. They've bred the vining characteristics out of most of zucchini squash. Most of them are a compact or bush plant now, so they're not really going to grow up a trellis in the same way that a melon would, because they just don't really. Some of the older like butternut squashes and those that they would grow up a trellis, but not zucchini specifically.